and thank you, Ebrat. I have to say, I'm just really, really excited to be here. So I was telling them on the pre-meeting that I do a lot of talks on complexity leadership, but I don't often get an opportunity to talk to a group that's interested in complexity. So this is really exciting to me, and I'm going to take you up on the fact that you're interested in complexity and hope that we can have some conversation around that. What I will do is I'm going to present it. Oh, I'm trying to do screen sharing, so Ebrat, you'll have to allow me to share my screen as I'm teeing up here. So I will be presenting by starting with the more practitioner-oriented approach, because that's just, I think, an easy way to enter. And then from there, I'll give you a bit of the theoretical background and the academic. I'm going to start with some of the work that I've done in complexity, but I also want to talk about some really exciting developments that have been happening based on a book that Benjamin Lichtenstein wrote on generative emergence. So this is a 2014 book. This has been my Bible recently. I'm very, very excited about it. Benjamin and I are having really fantastic conversations. So I'll tell you a little bit about that. So let me see if I can get my slides up here first. All right. Great. Okay, so when we started this work in, let me think. I started in 2001. I was introduced to Russ Marion, who was doing complexity. And Jerry Hunt was the editor of Leadership Quarterly, asked me to write a paper with him because Russ was writing on it, but nobody was understanding what he was talking about with the complexity work. So my job was to translate it for a leadership audience and see if I could make sense of it. We made progress on that. And then around 2005, we had a meeting of complexity scholars. We had two meetings, actually. We brought a whole bunch of people together, complexity scientists, people with different backgrounds, some leadership people, and had a conversation and said, so how should we go about this? Should we do this together? Or should we do it separately? And the conversation was, let's all go see what we can figure out on our own, and then see where that takes us. And that's why I'm really excited about Benjamin's book, because I went with Russ Marion and we started delving into complexity leadership and did a really intensive research practice partnership, which is what generated this work and why I can present this in a way that makes sense to practice. Benjamin went and did generative emergence and really was drawing more from complexity sciences and the emergence element. And what I'm going to show you is that we landed in the exact same place. I mean, literally, precisely the exact same place. So to me, this is real evidence of the validity of the work. It's triangulation in a research process where you do it separately and then find out that you're landing on the same thing. So what I'm going to do is show you first what I call the adaptive process. And then from there, I'm going to show you what Benjamin talks about with this adaptive process. I'm going to fly through some pieces of it that I normally do in more detail because we don't need it here. You can find that in other webinars that I've done. And I found out I've only got 30 minutes, so I have to talk pretty fast here. So I'm going to fly through these slides. All right, so let me start. The general intro of complexity leadership is that old models of leadership were managerial. They were focused on top down. But what we do with complexity is we view leadership as enabling an adaptive process. And I have done a lot of work on relational leadership as well to provide the theoretical background for that. Really, it's leadership at all levels. So you'll hear people refer to this as shared leadership, distributive leadership, collective leadership, relational leadership. It's all of those things. It sees leadership as a co-creation among individuals. So individuals get together, they co-create leadership by engaging in leading and following acts that create leadership. It constructs it. And then that leadership can occur anywhere in the organization. It doesn't have to be just in the hierarchical levels. All right, so what we've been realizing as we've done the work is that we're focusing on a theory of leadership for adaptability. And we had a concept that I generated with Michael Arena, who is my practice partner. He was the chief talent officer at General Motors. He's now in talent management at Amazon. And we had this concept of adaptive space, saying that to be able to enable complexity leadership, you have to have adaptive space. Michael got very, very excited, went off and wrote a book on it. But what I was discovering was he couldn't define it. And we knew it. We knew intuitively what it was, but we couldn't put words on it. So as he went off to write the book, I started thinking more deeply about the definition and what is it. And that's what generated this adaptive process. So At the core of complexity and complexity leadership is the adaptive process that starts when there are pressures on a system. So a system, you all know systems, I don't have to define it. Pressures come into a system. It can be a person, a group, an organization, any kind of collective. And that pressure then activates an energy around novelty, a need to innovate. So there's a push for something new, novelty, something different. But in that push for novelty, there's also a need for stability or a need for production. So you can think about this yourself. Anytime you've been put into an adaptive situation, you've got one side of your head saying, yeah, let's go do this. And the other side is saying, wait, hold on a second. So these two things go into tension. Now, what we found is that in organizations, this tension, and in leadership, this tension is not well understood. And what we've done in leadership is we've taught people to get rid of the tension. So Ron Heifetz at Harvard was really very early in recognizing this and started writing about tension. He was the only one that did it. But this tension dynamic is at the core of the adaptive process and of complexity. So you need to have it. As we were doing this work early on, people weren't getting the word tension. So we changed it to conflicting. So this process of these two things, these dynamics, these pushes from different forces or counter forces, they come together in tension, but it's conflicting. They're conflicting up against each other. In complexity, this is referred to as heterogeneity, and it talks about partners or partnerships, agents that have conflicting worldviews. So you need to capitalize on the heterogeneity or the conflicting. So the key in adaptability is to engage that conflicting, that tension. In the world in the past, and this is a while past now, it was the case that we didn't have much conflicting. I would say now where we are in leadership because of social media and power shifts in organizations and in society is we have a lot of conflicting. We have lots and lots of people now who have opinions, who think they're the experts, who are trying to advance things. And the challenge we have is not the conflicting piece. We've gotten really good at that. Just go open any newspaper, go watch any TV show, you'll see conflicting everywhere. The problem we have is with the conflicting, you have to have connecting. So you have to be able to find connecting amidst the conflicting. And this is really the key. This is the key to the adaptive process and the key to enabling leadership. This is what we call adaptive space. So adaptive space is the place or the conditions that engage this conflicting and connecting to be able to generate sparks of novelty or creativity that can be advanced into the organization in the form of adaptive outcomes or adaptive solutions. So that's what generates adaptability. All right, that's the core process. I'm going to show you this in different ways, but the nice thing about this model is it has innovation in it, which a lot of organizations are really excited about. And they focus only on innovation. There's a long story here. I think they're off track with it. I think what they're really trying to do is get at adaptability, and they're not messaging right with just saying everybody should be innovative, because everybody can't be innovative. But innovation is still here. But in addition, we have the need to produce. So this model focuses on the importance of production and results. It's much more realistic to the world of the practitioner. Many times in leadership, we don't focus enough on that. All right, so the adaptability gives us sustainability for the long term. So what we end up having is the current results, which is what we need for the present survival, but then we have adaptability, which gives us sustainability over the long term. All right, as I mentioned, the key to complexity leadership is adaptive space. So what is adaptive space? Well, it's the conditions that allow that adaptive process to occur. So when you have pressures that come on a system, they create an adaptive challenge. That challenge says we need to do something different. So that then activates the adaptive process. It's normal and natural for people to start ideating in the face of adaptive challenges. Now, what Benjamin has found and we found in our work is there are two ways this can happen. One is it can be opportunity tension in the entrepreneurial world, which is what Benjamin looks at. So a person who's more entrepreneurial, who says, I've got ideas, we need to drive change in the system. Or it can be adaptive tension, which is what we've all experienced this last year with COVID, and that we have a pressure that's forcing us to have to change. We have no choice, it's adapt or die. That's an adaptive tension. And then with that adaptive tension, we've got to figure out how we get to what we call an adaptive response or an adaptive solution. So you've got the need to innovate, the novelty and the ideation. In our research, we found that's not the hard part. People come up with ideas. Ideas are everywhere. As Michael Arena said in our work, ideas are cheap. So that's not the issue. The issue is how do you get the idea into a workable solution that will be able to connect with the operational or this need to produce and generate an outcome that leads to long-term viability. Okay, so that's the basic process. All right, so what I'm going to do now is show you this process mapped onto an organization, because that dynamic I just showed you, the adaptive process, you can also call it the tension dynamic. It's a fractal dynamic. It can occur at any level. So it can occur in our heads. And if we had time, I could walk you through that. And anytime you've had to adapt in your own head, that process I just showed you has happened in your head. But now I'm going to map it onto the organization, or you could call this a society, but an organization is any kind of collective social group, and show you how this works in that system. All right, so pressures come in, they hit the local. So pressures come in on a local level. They don't come into the entire organization. They're experienced in pockets, and the pockets will experience it differently as well. So the challenging thing about complexity is some areas will experience it one way, some will not be in complexity, or some will experience it differently. So when I started this work, I was really, really excited about the concept of local that comes from complexity. I think it's critically important, heavily misunderstood in leadership. You know, if you think about the benchmarking, that movement that we had many years ago, people were trying to benchmark and just pull ideas from other organizations, and they found out that didn't work. You can't even take ideas from inside the same organization and have it not necessarily work, because every situation is unique. Everybody's in a local context. All right, so the pressures come into the local. That sparks or activates that push for novelty, and we call that the entrepreneurial system. So it starts to trigger entrepreneurial. Entrepreneurial is learning, innovation, adaptability, growth. So it's focused on those kinds of things, creativity. All right, so on a local level then, people start to ideate and they socialize their ideas. This is a collective creativity process as described by Hargadon and Bechke in a beautiful paper years ago that they published, a qualitative study. So it's a collective creativity process. And again, we could delve into a lot of discussion around what that looks like, but they start to ideate, they get an idea, they start to implement it locally, and they say, well, we want to now scale this. And this is typical in innovation. And you talk to people in organizations, they'll talk about the need to scale. So they want to scale it, they want to take it bigger. Well, to do that, they have to then drive it out into the organization in a process of emergence. So this emergence mindset is really critical. People need to understand organizations are not top down, they're not linear, they're not driven by command and control. They are an emergent situation in which if you're trying to drive this process, you have to bring an emergence mindset to it. All right, so the entrepreneurial locals try to drive this out. And what happens next is for this to work, it has to go into adaptive space. So if an organization or a collective does not have adaptive space, it will not have the conditions for conflicting and connecting to occur. And as a result, the idea is likely to get shut down because systems are really, really, really good at pulling back to equilibrium. They will, in our research, I know early on Russ Marion believed you could put an organization into complexity. I don't believe that. I think it has to have pressures, and it has to be in complexity pressures for it to change, because I've seen just way too much stability and pull back to equilibrium. So there has to be adaptive space opened up. That adaptive space then creates the conditions for the conflicting and connecting for this thing to conflict, which is always going to happen, but then connect and scale up. And the key there is then it needs to get into the formal operational system. So the adaptive space is trying to help you create those conditions for it to emerge into and link up into the operational system. This requires a lot of refinement and revision throughout. So when I work with leaders, I have conversations with them about how they do this. They have to recognize that conflicting is going to happen. They're going to get pushback. When they get pushback, they should pull it back to their local, iterate the idea, take that as feedback, and then try it again. But what you're essentially asking is these other network areas to also iterate and change, and that's not an easy thing to do. So there's a whole process around this, and I've given other talks, so you can go watch those if you're interested. All right, so then once that happens and it gets into the operational system, that's when you have adaptability. That's when you have an adaptive outcome, and it feeds back on the system in the form of new order. All right, so that's the adaptive process mapped on the organization. If we put leadership on this, then we have in the entrepreneurial system what we call entrepreneurial leadership, which is the ideation, the generating and really scaling up and energizing an adaptive solution. And then we have enabling leadership, which is a very different kind of activity. That means the individuals or the groups have the ability to make those connections. They can navigate the emergence process in the organization. They are skilled usually in networks. They're skilled in persuasion and influence. They understand how to deal with the conflicting, to break down barriers or break down walls or any obstacles that are facing the innovation that's trying to scale. And they're really, really good at linking up, right? So this is a process of linking up. And then there's operational leadership. So the operational leadership is what we've always had in organizations. The difference here is that in this case, it has to be flexible. So what's different about operational leadership and the complexity leadership model is it's flexible to be able to accommodate change. This is a mindset difference. We work with organizations to get leaders there. And what they then do in the organizations we've been successful in, they actually go out and they're like, give us your ideas. We want it. We're trying to drive strategy. We have strategic initiatives. We know what our initiatives are. We need your ideas. In healthcare, we've been doing this, and they say, doctors, we know that you don't understand the business side or how to put a business case around it. Bring us your idea. We will literally help you put the business case around it to try to get this into the system, right? So that's a very different kind of mindset in operational leadership. All right, so now I'm going to give you some definitions. Entrepreneurial leadership, individuals and groups who act as leaders regardless of title, to advance novelty leading to beneficial change. So these are people who see the entrepreneurial opportunities, are able to identify needs and problems and link them up with creative solutions. And typically here, when we're working with leaders, we're trying to get them to think outside the box. Then there's enabling leadership. These are individuals, and it can be groups of individuals, but this is really more, this requires a very different kind of leadership skill. They're often in positions of authority. And what they do is they enable and protect adaptive space. So the left picture here is nurturing the idea. That's the adaptive space that's needed for ideas to be able to surface, crystallize, energize, amplify, all of those things. It needs protection. And there is a skill, an enabling leadership skill around doing that. And then the right-hand side, I get really excited about this picture because this is such a beautiful depiction of emergence. It's the messiness of emergence. It's nonlinear, it's up and down and all around. Sometimes you hit dead ends. It's just a really topsy-turvy process really to get through, but then you're driving through the emergence to try to get it to scale up. One of the key things we say to leaders here is, to the entrepreneurial leaders, don't fall in love with your idea, because your idea is going to morph and change and adapt as it goes across the organization. So it's not about getting my specific idea in, it's about the change, the type of change I'm trying to drive, and recognizing that that is going to be different by the time it gets to the outcome. As long as it's accomplished the basic goal I had in mind, then I was successful. And then operational leadership. So as I said before, these are individuals who accommodate the change, and they do that by realigning and loosening up the operational system to be able to generate new order. So again, I love this picture because you see the messiness of the emergence coming in, and then what happens is they're able to put it into something that makes sense. So they take the messiness and they operationalize it into something that will generate alignment, efficiency, order to be able to produce the outcomes for sustainability for the long term. Okay, now this one I'm going to go through really, really fast because I want to spend some time at the end. So I'm just going to show you one more time the adaptive process and how it works. So this is an animation that I have. So on the left-hand side, we have an agent, and this one is a human agent, but agents can be non-human as well. And this is an agent under pressure. So it starts to energize and pulsate under pressure, gets an idea, starts to socialize the idea locally, does that through collective creativity, a huge process all around that. And then as it gets to grow, this thing starts to take off. So they're still in their local with the idea generating. Then what they need to do is they need to go out to other areas. So now they're trying to scale it. When I work with practitioners, I ask them what this picture is, and they often don't get it. It's shocking to me, but they don't know that this is a network. This is a network map. You would be really surprised to know how many people have never seen a network map. And this is really essential because complexity is a network theory. Organizations operate as networks. They get the concept of networking, but we really need to start thinking about organizations as network dynamics. All right, so now this group starts to try to aggregate and scale this, and they go out and they reach out to the others and they start to link up a bit. But what is going to happen, this always will happen, is they're going to hit conflicting. And this is what many people don't understand, what conflicting is and how it works. So we work with them to get them to understand this is a natural part of the process and to be expected. It's not failure. It's not a brick wall. Don't take pushback as a brick wall and you're stopped. And whatever you do not set up a meeting and ask for a yes, no. This is the most important thing. What you're trying to do here is inquiry and conversation. Do not ask for a yes, no, because once you ask for a yes, no, and you get a no, you're stuck. That is not the way to frame things up. So you're doing more of an inquiry approach. All right, so then once you get that pushback, what you have to do is take it back and iterate it. So there's local iteration. You take the feedback and the information, come back, you say, okay, what does that mean? What did I just learn? How do I iterate this so that I can now connect? So reach out again. And now the connection has occurred. So there's success, and these other areas are now going to change. So this is the key thing, and what you have to understand about why this is so difficult. You're basically asking them to change. So the iteration this time occurs in the other units as they start to take on the new order. All right, so this process continues, and it continues to reach out and across, conflicting, connecting all the way through until it hits this point of this gray dot. And this gray dot is really, really important. This gray dot is a sponsor, what we call a sponsor. And so what this person or agent or people does is try to tip it into the operational system. What I will tell you is that the left side of the picture, the entrepreneurial, we don't have problems with. People can do that. The middle part, some people can get to places in that to build some energy around a movement in an organization. The real problem we've seen, and it is a massive problem, is this part right here of tipping it into the operational system. And this is where a sponsor really is important. We can talk more about that. I can tell you more what they do, but essentially what they're doing is they link it up and connect it into the operational system to help that system realign. And that's the new order. Okay, so I'm carefully watching my time. Here's the problem of bureaucracy, and we can talk about bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is the enemy of adaptability, and it's just like fighting a system. This picture is not resonating as much anymore because now we have less bureaucracy than we did when I started using it, but I still enjoy the picture. And then we have the problem of the brick wall, which is what I told you earlier of them trying to scale and push, but they hit what they call the brick wall. And this term came from people I was talking with and from our research, from our teaching and our research. These are their words. They'd say, yeah, I'm doing everything you're saying, but I hit the brick wall. So we spent a lot of time talking about how to not hit the brick wall and what that means. All right, so here's the theoretical basis, and this is the part where I'm going to now wrap it up and show you how this ties to what I was talking about earlier with the complexity research. So I'm going to use Benjamin's work, which is the book I've been showing you, and then also the 2018 paper that we wrote to try to get everything we learned from practice back into theory, into the research. That was a paper that I wrote with Michael and LQ. All right, so here's the LQ paper. I don't have a whole lot of time to describe this, but I have to tell you, I can geek out on this. This is where I get really academically geeky because I find it absolutely fascinating and so exciting. This is a result of a literature review that we did on adaptability. When I started looking to see what was out there. At first, I couldn't find it. I had to work really hard because there's nothing really called adaptability. They don't use those words. But I started to find it in different literatures. And then when I saw it, it was everywhere. But not only was it everywhere, it was our three-circle model. So the three-circle model that we had generated in our complexity leadership research from complexity theory and then from our practice work is everywhere in the literature. It's all over strategy. It is the classic March exploration exploitation, and where they've gone into ambidexterity. It's dynamic capability, operational capability, adaptive capability. It's flexibility, efficiency, differentiation, and integration and org theory. It's in entrepreneurship, they talk about it as endogenous entrepreneurship, operating core, absorptive capacity. In the classic OT literature, very, very early on, we had organic, mechanistic, and then as they've been developing that in the structure area, they call it temporary decentralization. And then in leadership, it would be the informal bottom up, the formal top down, with now what's collaboration and network. So that is just really cool, because what we have found is a very pervasive dynamic. This is everywhere. I think it really helps to explain what's going on. And we see lots of people talking about it, but not realizing they're discussing the same thing. And then the other cool piece is this tension is everywhere in the literature. It's not obvious. You go read it and it starts to pop out to you, but you have to understand what you're looking for. Nobody's known what to do with this. They haven't talked about it, but it's all over the literature. And then in addition to the tension, they talk about integrating. So that would be my conflicting and connecting in our model. So bottom line here, a tremendous amount of support in the literature for what we have found. This is in entrepreneurship, this is the transformation process. And actually it comes from dynamic capabilities too. And I'm just showing you this to show you how this is our model. So you start with the initial configuration, then you go for a transformation and then a new configuration. But they talk about exogenous shock, which is our pressures, and then endogenous entrepreneurship, which is our entrepreneurial leadership ideation, and then the feedback and the new order. So again, when I saw this, this is really what helped me to map out the adaptive process from the 2018 piece. That's how I got to the development of that adaptive process model. And then this is innovation. So innovation has now started to link up with networks. Thank goodness our areas are finally starting to talk to each other a little bit, but it starts with ideation, and then in the network literature, that's brokering and structural holes. Then there's idea elaboration, and in networking, that's cohesion. Then there's championing and amplification, which is brokering and structural holes. Then there's adoption, which is network closure, and implementation, which is network closure. So Michael had already linked up, and when he wrote his Adaptive Space book, his whole book was on network, because he had partnered with, he had brought Ron Burt in, and we talked with him. Not Ron Burt is the network theorist at University of Chicago. And so we talked with him, and he started laying this out. And that really helped Michael in the practice work to know what to do as a chief learning officer in terms of trying to enable networks and network dynamics. All right, so here's Benjamin's work, which is distributive structures. And what Benjamin did is he went to, the whole first part of this book, first third, maybe even more than that, is a review of complexity. He pulls together all the different complexity sciences. And then what he does is he realizes from that distributive structures is the one that has the most relevance for what we're talking about in leadership and organization. And this is a real clarification for us, because when I started the work, we were using all different kinds of complexity sciences. And I wasn't a complexity scientist, so I didn't know these different areas and fields. All right, so what Benjamin did was he then took distributive structures theory and the concepts of far from equilibrium thermodynamics and law of maximum entropy production, and then emergence. So his real focus has been on emergence. And this is helpful to us because where I had the biggest breakthrough in our work was when I brought Bill McKelvey and Russ Marion together in the 2007 paper. Russ came from a biological Kaufman order for free model, and Bill came from more European model doing thermodynamics and distributive structures. And I knew that what Bill had to offer was really beneficial. So that's why that paper was a breakthrough. And now Benjamin has taken that and really laid it out. So I'm going to show you what he's done with that. All right, so this is the start of it where it talks about basically the Bernard experiments. And the idea is that there's a container, so something is contained, but then it starts to heat up. So the pressures are, it heats up inside of this container, and then that creates turbulence in the system, and the thing goes into flux. And then what they studied was what happens and how does it generate new order in that. And this has really been validated over and over again with Prigogine and Stengers, but there's an experimental outcome after a threshold point in which new order emerges. So you see the more complexity language here, but essentially what Benjamin's doing is using physics and physical sciences to describe an emergence process that also applies to social systems. When he laid that out, he originally had 5, but now he's down to 4 conditions, which I agree with because his 4 conditions map perfectly onto ours. So his 4 conditions in emergence and generative emergence are disequilibrium, which is far from equilibrium. Then you have fluctuations, which are experiments. And that when those experiments start to take off, they amplify. That's our emergence process. That then generates into emergence of new order. And then the final state is stabilizing feedbacks. All right, so he has lots of basis for that. Here's his model again. In the first stage, he calls it organizing because he comes from an entrepreneurial background. So he's doing this work in entrepreneurship. In the second stage, he talks about stress, experiments, and a critical threshold. A critical threshold is a breakthrough where it starts to tip into new order. And then the emergence is a recombination, and stabilizing feedback is where it starts to be formalized into the new order. So if I take that and I put it on our model, which I've already shown you, then we can see very clearly how the 2 things work together. So here's Benjamin's disequilibrium. That's what we would call pressures. And the pressures can come from either side, but when we do our emergence one, we draw that picture starting from the left-hand side. I can talk more about that, but the idea of that is that it starts with the ideation. So that's the disequilibrium, is the pressures that puts the system into a far from equilibrium state. Then you have amplification. As you start at the bottom here, as you start to energize and activate this, now you're trying to scale it. And then he has an emergence process. So his emergent stage maps exactly onto what we're talking about. And then his stabilizing feedback is the new order. So as you see, this is why I'm excited. We have, I think, a lot of validation around a model. Let me just conclude by talking for a minute about COVID, because we all know COVID, and it's something that we can use to help us understand this process. So I'm going to circle back to like a more practical, just for my conclusion, which is what happened in COVID is that the world went into complexity. And we all know that. So now people understand that we are in complexity. They might not know what it means, but they know we're in it. That complexity required every one of us, the entire world, to have to adapt. That complexity came from an emergence dynamic of a virus that was in a bat that bit a pangolin. This is the story, we don't know, but let's just go with the story. Bit a pangolin that a human ate, that a human then got sick. So an interactive nonlinear effect of a human eating this animal that generates a novel coronavirus. That's an amplification critical threshold kind of situation. And then because we are so interconnected in the world, that spread rapidly. So that is a complexity emergence dynamic that put all of us then into a complexity pressure of disequilibrium to put us in a far from equilibrium state. When that happened, it naturally opened up adaptive space. So adaptive space is conditions that allow the adaptive process to occur. In most organizations, adaptive space is not there. That's the problem we have. Organizations that are in equilibrium do not have the conditions for the process to emerge. They have conditions for stability and order. So complexity pressures are what open up those conditions or create the adaptive space. When that space opened up for us, the world then had an opportunity to adapt and innovate and change in ways it would never have been able to do otherwise. That's why we see us out now all on Zoom. That's why we see doctors on telehealth and doing medicine through remote. We see all kinds of changes that have come from that. So that adaptive space opens up. This is Winston Churchill's never waste a good crisis. He didn't know it, but what he was talking about is a crisis puts a situation into disequilibrium that opens adaptive space that allows change to occur. That's essentially a complexity dynamic. That's essentially what he was meaning. And so then once that happens, it's open, but then it's going to close. So this adaptive space we're in is already starting to close a bit, and we're locking into a new order. We see this. It will eventually close and we'll be in a new order, and then it will be harder for things to change again. So that is, I think you're getting what complexity is and how it works. And the leadership process around this is, how do we lead to enable an adaptive response rather than an order response? In an order response, we deny the complexity is happening. We try to stay in the old order. And if we look at leaders in the world, failed leaders, we had one in our country, they did an order response, trying to stay in the old order. So what we really need is leadership skills of people who can understand how to enable an adaptive response using the process I just described. Okay, so at that I will conclude, and I think I'm back to Andre, right?
That's it. Yeah, I was just unmuting myself. Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Mary. Such a rich and energetic presentation. There's so many ideas that it provoked, I must say, and or resonated with rather, including, for example, a long conversation that we had here in the strategy group about approaching strategy and strategic management as enabled emergence. Right? So as a process of doing something in that space, in the adaptive space. And I must admit, I didn't know that, I didn't know the connection between Benjamin's ideas and yours, but I've also been taken by his book as well. And I was at his first emergence caucus at the Academy of Management a long time ago. But if I may just ask you to talk a little bit more about this idea of emergence and what it looks like in organizations, because theoretically, in theory, it's an uncontrollable process, right? You can't really engineer emergence, or you can't design certain things. It's a property of the system, or dynamic within the system, and it's certainly poorly understood. And one of my colleagues at Oxford actually calls it a weasel word. You know, so if you don't know how something is produced, you call it emergence. But what really is it? And suppose more importantly, can you do anything in the adaptive space still with the kind of prescriptive design-centered approach, or does it call for different ways of acting in that space, in that world?
It's such a great question, Andre, and I get that people think it's a weasel word, but it's really not. So I just want to say this. It's a weasel word for people who don't necessarily understand it. If you understand it, and if your brain works to understand and have an emergence mindset, it's crystal clear in terms of what emergence is. And so those of us who work in this, or who understand it, and I know on here is what is a student. So I see Edmonia Baker has joined. She's a doctoral student I'm working with in Copenhagen Business School. And she and I have connected, and I really think that we've connected because she has an emergence mindset and gets it. So I just call her out to say that, you know, if you have a mind that works this way and understands it, you get it. The people who struggle are those who don't really have the right mindset for it. Would you agree with that, Edmonia?
Yes, I will definitely agree with that, Mary. But it's also always a difficult conversation to have. You know, then what does it mean, right?
Yes. And so is it a Weasley word to you, or is it crystal clear?
To me?
Yes.
It's not a Weasley word. It's crystal clear.
Okay, so your mind also operates in this way of you understand. So I'll call it, I might call on you again in a second, but thank you for chiming in. But I think that the point here is that if you have the mindset that understands it, what you do is you understand that the world is interactive, that it is not a linear, deterministic, controlled world. And you understand that things occur in interactions. And so you're looking to see what are those things that are going to interact or engage together in ways that can generate something that would be unpredictable, but it's predictable in the short term. So in the short term, if you know the dynamics, and the dynamics are what I talked about, the dynamics are conflicting and connecting. So things come together and they conflict, but if they can find a connection, when they connect, they generate what's called a phase transition. So a phase transition is a transition to a new state. It can produce something that we didn't expect to see produced before. And that's really exciting. So people I know, and we've worked with a bunch of them because we have a practice group, and I would include Edmonia in that, a practice group who has been along through this whole journey. These are people with emergence mindsets and who are complexity thinkers. And it's so natural to them. And if you were to ask them the question, is this prescriptive? They would say, no, it's not prescriptive. You can't prescribe. But what you can do is you can use your thinking to engage with it. So they're really, really good at engaging with the emergence because they watch the dynamics. They're looking for things out there that might link up. And if they link up, they'll create a phase transition. Now, the easiest answer here is, this is why Benjamin studies complexity in entrepreneurship. Because entrepreneurs, this is what they do. What entrepreneurs do is they look out and they see that there are opportunities, and these opportunities can be influenced if they engage with them a certain way. So if we take Jeff Bezos at Amazon, my gosh, I mean, that's all emergence, but he drove that emergence by watching things that are going on, engaging, injecting things into the system in ways that can influence the way the dynamic goes.
Well, he couldn't have known the outcome of his actions, right?
But they're comfortable with that. That's the difference. And this is really what I was trying to describe earlier, is that it's not about my idea. It's not my specific idea, but I'm influencing where it's going to go. It will go somewhere, and then I can play in where it goes. So for us, this work, we didn't know where it was going to go. And I've had to learn all along emergence, because I'll have a word. I'll tell you, the biggest problem I've had with this is we've had to morph words all throughout. So I'll fall in love with the word, and then it's like, oh, I got to drop that word. So we have done that entirely. Every time I get into it, I'm like, darn it, I'm going to have to unlearn again the way that I've described this to take on the new learning. It's consistent throughout. I would say that the spirit of everything we've done is very consistent, but we've had to adapt and learn along the way. So it's not that it is, I think the problem is control, what people think of control. My view of control is, I think it's controllable if it's within this realm of a dynamic. And I walk into a classroom, any of you teaching probably can relate to this. If you do a style that's not lecture, I walk into a classroom or I come into a webinar and I say, I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm going to create the conditions, and I trust myself that I can engage with whatever's going on. So if I go into a classroom, let's say an exec one where I can really get a conversation going, that conversation is going to take off. It's not controllable, but I have enough expertise that I can trust in myself that I can engage with the emergence. I know I'm trying to get them to understand something about complexity. If I go in with a specific thing, that's a lecture, but instead I see where they are, I let it surface, and then they learn whatever element they need to learn. On the simplest level, that would be describing emergence.
Which is very different from the traditional way we kind of teach strategy and organizational design.
Yes, totally.
Maybe one more question from me, and I'll pass it over to Ibrad. But can you talk a little bit more about the managerial practices or leadership practices that are needed for that space, for that in that space, for that process?
Thank you for that question, because I wanted to go there, but I didn't want to keep talking. So now you have to continue the stream. So managers who do this well, and we have one that I work with right now. His name is Brian Allenk, and he's at Capital One. Brian is one of these people I've been talking about, who's an emergence thinker. He also, I linked up with him maybe 4 or 5 years ago when we were doing interviews, and I realized he gets it. So I just listened to him, because this is when we were in our active stage of our qualitative research and gathering information. Well, Brian, we haven't had the chance to talk for a couple of years. We've reconnected, and now he's talking everything. So when he talks, what he has learned in practice maps perfectly onto our model. So he's excited because he's like, oh yeah, well, Mary can tell you what it is I'm doing, because she has the framework to describe it. He was trying to develop his own framework. But essentially, he does exactly this process. Now, what Brian has learned is he has now gotten so good at it. He started off, so he works at Capital One, he's in the card area, and he was very much an entrepreneurial thinker. So he was an individual in an organization who was doing the entrepreneurial, then he learned the enabling himself, and he started to drive emergence in terms of really trying to drive change. The words we would use in practice are driving change, but he was doing this in a complexity way. So then what happened was he was what we call flying under the radar. He was doing this stuff, and this stuff is really fun. If you know what you're doing and nobody else knows what you're doing, you can fly under the radar and you kind of sneak this stuff in. So that's what he and I were talking about a few years ago. What happened was he started to get noticed and recognized. And now he's on the radar. He describes this, and we were talking at this time, as danger. It was danger, because if you think about being on the radar, now you're a target, people can shoot you down. So he had to then really morph to learn how to do this in a way that he wasn't going to get shot down. And so what he did is he started to recognize the collective process and all of the collective that went into it. So the challenge and where he would get shot down is if he was ego-driven and it was perceived as power in politics. Instead, he would say, he would link up what he was doing with other people, and then he would bring those people in, and he would not take the credit. He would acknowledge the collective that went into it. This then really elevated him. Now he's on the more executive level, and now he's literally training the rest of the executive team on how to do this process. He's calling it, in his words, the innovation flywheel. But his innovation flywheel is our model. So now he and I are going to write this up in a paper. I have a target for it. So I'm going to take his words and what he's doing, the practice words, and map it onto our model and help people understand the framework. But essentially, he now says in his innovation flywheel, he's constantly looking for ideas. So let me tell you two more things about Brian. When we started, the most interesting thing I found a few years ago was I said, how do you have time for this? How do you do this in the organization? He said, well, I have a portfolio of results. And I said, tell me what you mean by that. He said, because what we know is in organizations, this work isn't rewarded because people don't understand this as leadership. So what Brian was doing, people don't recognize. This doesn't look like classic leadership to them. So he had to still produce results. So he said, what I've done for myself, and this is innovation, I created a portfolio of results. So this is maybe 2016. He said, I have it out to about 2019 right now. So I have all my stuff in place that it's going to deliver results. That then frees up time for me to do the work I want to do, which is this complexity and innovation work. All right, so that was really cool. Well, now where he is, he's so good at it and people are recognizing and rewarding him for it finally, that he is now has a portfolio of potential emergence events. So what he'll do now is instead of thinking about the result side, he's thinking about the idea side, and he has multiple ones based on pressures because he's constantly scanning the environment for opportunities. You would call this opportunity tension and entrepreneurial work. And he goes out and he sees which ones do people have ideas around. So now all of his work is around talking with people to see where's their energy. Is there a solution? Is this something I should run with? So then he won't go with the one he wants. He'll go with the one that there's energy around, and that's his flywheel. So then he starts to do the process of linking it up and managing the conflicting, connecting to get people in the organization energized around that. And he can now spearhead multiple ones of these, very much on the radar.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think again it resonates with quite a lot of conversations we've been having here, and I think it also speaks to a very, I would say, radically processual view of the organization. Right? And it's a very dynamic view. I don't want to take up more time. Ibrad.
Thank you, Andre, and thank you, Mary. A very fascinating talk, and very helpful insights. My question to you, I suppose, is more coming from the research side of things. After doing this research on complexity and leadership for 20 years, where do you see this research going forward?
That's a great question. I've been giving some thought to this lately, so I'm hesitating a little bit on here in terms of how I say this. I'm going to own up and fess up that I've been holding this stuff pretty tight. So people have been contacting me. Early on, they were saying, where's your measure? And I just don't really even reply to that. I mean, there's not a measure. This is not leadership where we're going to put together a 7-item measure that measures an entrepreneurial leader or an enabling leader. It's not the right mindset. So I've pretty much ignored that. People on the leadership side then have learned to pretty much ignore me because they want to measure and they want to do quant work and survey work. But the other thing I think I've done is I realized the danger of this getting out in ways that people who don't understand it will take it and morph it and use the words and the language, but do it in a way that's not appropriate or accurate. So that's where I will say to you, I've been holding tight. I'm not interested in getting famous. I'm not interested in having a theory and a school of people who follow me. I'm really interested in advancing work that has real meaning for the world. And I believe passionately this work is it. And so does Benjamin. When I spoke with him a couple of weeks ago, he said, Mary, this stuff is so powerful. This is really an answer to how we can help humanity in the world from his entrepreneurship standpoint. And I've heard the exact same thing from the practice group. I have a former CEO, a retired CEO, who absolutely believes this work can change the world. So I've been holding very closely to it. I think now what I'm working on doing is I've got the language and the messaging right. I'm confident it's really validated. So I'm finding ways to get it out in messages that are appropriate and hopefully can't be taken and morphed in an inappropriate way. So I'm doing practice articles. I've done a couple of research articles. COVID was a really good opportunity for me to get some papers out to show people what's going on. I'm going to work on hopefully a theory piece that lays out the adaptive process and try to target that at a top journal. And then I'm going to work on a research book and a practice book. So, and as far as other people, I'm not so worried where they go with it right now. But I'm working with people like Edmonia. So Edmonia really, as I mentioned before, really gets this. And her mind works the way, her mind is an emergence complexity mind. So I am just encouraging her to do her qualitative work in a way that allows the work to tell the story and isn't driven by theory, because I think that too often our theory-driven approaches, particularly in leadership, are really creating problematic models. So she's on the issue of tension. She's focusing on the tension dynamic. She's now using a context of gender and women's issues and looking at the challenge of conflicting and how do you get even the connecting around the problem. So that's going to tell us more about the tension dynamic. There are other contexts that can do that. And then I have another former student I'm working with. We've got a paper on tension dynamic. So we're going to kind of sneak this stuff out and just like the fly under the radar approach, sneak it out and try to get enough out there. But I will tell you about, it's all over the literature. So the 2018 piece really showed it. It convinced me we don't need to have a whole lot of studies on this because of the fact of the matter is we have them already. They're everywhere. What we need is an organizing framework, a meta theory, if you will, to pull together all the findings we have and make sense of them, because so many people are doing studies, but who's doing the work of saying, this is what it all means when you put it together in the big picture? So I'm sorry, long answer, but hopefully I got
That's good, it's helpful. And if I may, one more question perhaps related to this before we open it up is, what advice or maybe some avoiding traps or giving some tips to those who starting this journey doing research on complexity and leadership?
I think the good news is we have so much more understanding now than we did before. So we're starting in a place where we've done a lot of the pioneering work. And I think that the rigorous foundations are established. So people don't need to worry about rigor of this. It's there, it's established. It's very, very clear. This is a concept that's not only in the leadership literature now, this is a concept of the natural world. This dynamic we're talking about is a dynamic that is so robust and so profound in nature. This is how the natural world works. And as I said, it's fractal. So coming back again to how do you use this? the way, we knew in early leadership work that leadership was situational. They called it contingency theory, right? So I remember when I started off as a leadership scholar, it's like, okay, so we have these situational theories that say everything depends on the situation. And the contingency theories, when you teach it, it's like, okay, your leader style is going to lead to effectiveness depending on the situation. I can't tell you what that box is. I can't tell you how to do this. You got to go figure that out. I'm just telling you that it's situational, right? So that's always been part of leadership. They tried to get really prescriptive, and when they did, I think it bombed. I just think it bottomed out. But essentially what this is saying is, it is situational, but we can give you a dynamic. So if you understand the dynamic, if you can have an emergence mindset, an adaptive mindset, if you can understand that leadership is a collaboration, which we're calling the collaboration mindset, and that gets into all the network stuff as well, and the collective, that mindset then is what we train you in. And with that mindset, you can go out into your context and figure out how to do it in the situation. So we're teaching mindsets, dynamics, and processes rather than specific behaviors and styles.
Thank you, Mary.
Yes.
Andre?
Thank you. I think it's time for us to open it up to everyone on the call. We can do it in two ways, or we will do it in two ways. If you'd like to post a question in the chat room, please do. Ibrat is looking at the chat, and he will pose it to Mary. Alternatively, if you would like to speak and interact with Mary kind of live, just make sure you use the reactions button at the bottom of the screen to raise your hand, and then we'll come straight to you. And in the meanwhile, maybe Ibrat, maybe we'll start with a question from the chat room.
Yes. So I'll start with the in the order of appearance, or in chronological order, if you like. Matthew Archer says, "Many thanks, Mary. I always am so interested in this space of research and conclusions. What are some of the common tangible issues that you have learned working with organizations that prevent ideas to scale and come into new order?" And there's one more sentence he adds, "I find commonly that there are numerous interesting ideas, but very few are realized into practice, rightly and wrongly."
Yes, that is spot on. So it gets to a couple of issues I was alluding to in the talk. So one is this whole issue of what I call the brick wall. And again, I learned that from the practitioners. The brick wall, I think it's created in multiple ways. So one of the really difficult challenges we had when I was working with the practice group, and I have to tell you, these are high-level people. These are CEOs, people who are on the CEO 100 board. Their friends are all on the boards. And this particular person was a complexity thinker, and he was trying to find other CEOs and other board members who think like this. So he went out and he started thinking about it, came back and he said, "Mary, I'm really sorry to tell you, this is pretty dismal. This is really, really bleak. They don't think like this. What they think like is short-term and results. Everything is results. Everything is numbers, results, operational side focused," which we knew, but we didn't realize how bad the problem was. So I would say the bottom line, number one problem we have is the measurement, what I call the outcomes mindset, the measurement, reward systems, the mentality around results. And it doesn't have to be that way. So that was also, I knew that from practice, from our practice group. But then I found it when I did the 2018 piece and I started looking in research, and I was studying adaptability, and even the research that was looking at adaptability had no adaptive outcome measures. Their measures were all classic performance. So they'd look at adaptability and then they'd have a classic performance. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is really a problem. So I wrote that up in the discussion of that paper saying, we really need to start looking at outcomes and thinking about that. Now that then translates into incentives and reward systems in organizations and how we reward leadership. As I said to you about Brian, this kind of leadership isn't recognized. Now it's getting to be more so now. This is changing really quickly. But even as of 3-4 years ago, this kind of leadership was not recognized. And so as a result, people who were doing the more classic management results, operational kinds of things were the ones who were getting rewarded and moved up. they don't have the complexity and emergence mindsets unless they're like Brian and they've been able to sneak through because they fly under the radar by doing the operational and producing the results, but then doing these other things. All right. So, and the people who do this often drop out because they get tired. They get burned out or tired by trying to fight this in the organization. So those are all some dynamics around it. As far as specifics on every day, I think the biggest issue is when you have an operational leadership or system that doesn't recognize the importance of adaptability. That's the number one issue. And so they have a default or a bias to know. They don't want to do things that are new. They have a bias to know, and they are rewarded for the results they're producing in the short term. People who are trying to push innovation are shut down. So that's the operational side problem. There's a lack of enabling leadership. People don't know how to do that. And if they do, again, they're not recognized at all. And then the final piece is the entrepreneurial. Classically, the entrepreneurial are people who are idea people and they don't know how to do the enabling or how to talk to the operational. So then you have that problem of they're trying to push it, but they're using the wrong language. So this is a collective leadership process in that it requires different skills. I happen to have skills across just because that's who I am, and Brian does as well, but most people don't. So they have a strength in one of these areas. If they're entrepreneurial, typically they don't have a strength in how to sell this or how to do the networking and the connecting. So those are the challenges. So thank you for the question, Matthew. Sorry, I have to mute for a minute and clear my throat.
Fantastic. Yeah, I'll just add that it certainly resonates again with some of the work that I've been doing, because I originally come from the performance measurement background academically. And yeah, I also take a very critical look and very critical view of the dysfunctional effects that performance measures can generate. And in the meanwhile, we have a question from the audience, and it comes from your student, Antonia.
Yes.
Mary, hi everyone. It's not really a question. I just thought of something while you were talking, Mary. And in terms of the question, what can stand in the way of this? And I think you mentioned it yourself, Mary, tension and conflicting and connecting, but actually a leadership language that's not capable of connecting to tension, a leadership language that is not capable of opening up a space for conflicting and connecting around tension. That is actually something that I see in my research that actually stands in the way of adaptation, and stands in ways that people don't even they don't even realize that they're shutting down tension. It just happens automatically because we're educated to be on the same page, search for consensus, reach the goal, and all of these things, but it stands in the way of the tension that is, the process of adaptation. And that just, I thought of that while you were talking, Mary. And
Yes,
it's so subtle. We just don't have a language where, tension is often feels highly uncomfortable and inefficient. And I actually stress feel, because people feel uncomfortable and they want to shut it down. And that actually stands in the way of this. Mm-hmm. So I think there's something about, knowing how to be comfortable with the uncomfortable that is actually really key to this.
Yes. And as you and I both know, and we've learned recently, the other part of this is recognizing the whole person and the whole body in this work. So I think I did a talk at Durham, and they do psychology, but psychology, even psychiatry, in terms of how our body reacts to these kinds of things. When we're talking pressures and tension and stress, we're talking a physical reaction in the body and what it does to deal with this. And I think that ties into your point, Edmonia, that what we've typically done in organizations and in management is we go for the more rational, the disembodied kind of work. And I think it's time for us to really start digging deeper into the humanity that we bring to the workplace.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you, Edmonia. Another question in the chat is from Maggie Chak. Thank you, Mary. I happened to read your work in 2018, and I was very impressed by your theoretical work. My questions are more related to your experience and how leaders recognize and acquire the skills to react and be adaptive in practice. And how do you see the connection of your work to paradox theory?
Okay, thanks, Ebrat, and thanks, Maggie. So what I will say is that to this point, what we have done is we have found people who naturally know how to do this. So as I have referred to the practice group, I've been in the good fortune of, in complexity, you talk about an attractor theory, or there's an attractor. Fortunately, the work I do becomes an attractor, and so people who are attracted to it come to me. So I end up meeting a lot of these people. It's not anything I'm doing, it's just the nature of the work. Whereas others are trying to find each other. So I become like an attractor of all these people who say, yeah, I do that, I do that. So that's where our practice group originated. And we've learned from them. So we've done a lot of conversation. I have so much clear insight, and I have resources we can use with these people to try to really elaborate what they're doing. And that is clearly a next step. So a next step now is to elaborate more the leadership behaviors, the leadership mindsets, and more specifics around what these individuals do. I've also had the good fortune of being able to teach this in the classroom. And in this last year, because we went to complexity, so I always did it kind of, I was struggling. Do I give them the classic stuff? Do I do my stuff? And they would encourage me to do my stuff, but so many people were still needing the classic that I was kind of doing a hybrid. But this last year with complexity, I was finally able to morph it and merge it all together and taught whole courses on this. So I'm starting to also put out some developmental, educational, pedagogical kinds of things. Mindsets are one of those. We have some behaviors and some other pieces. So I don't have time to go into those now, but I will tell you that those things are coming. We're going to have materials coming out on them. And Maggie, if you want to write me, I can give you more specifics and share a syllabus and that kind of thing.
Can I do a quick follow-up on this, Ebrat, if you don't mind? Mary, I'm just kind of curious, when you talk about this, maybe more to, say, executives rather than your postgraduate students, do you encounter a lot of resistance and skepticism, or do you find that you're pushing in an open door?
So I encountered mostly resistance and skepticism for the first part of this. There's no question. I mean, we had to be pretty darn tough. We had a lot of bullets. We had to go in being able to take a lot of shots early in the work. It started to tip around 2010, and that's because we had the GFC. So the global financial crisis really helped people to understand that we're in a complex world. And then the next stage of it was 2014. In 2014, I don't know what happened. It just so happened that it was that year that I saw this. So I would talk about in 2010, the tower, it fell over, it tipped over into complexity, right? The GFC got leaders. That was when the IBM Global CEO report came out. They said the #1 issue facing executives and leaders in the world is complexity. And we anticipate complexity is only going to continue to grow. And the fact of the matter is we have no idea what to do about it. So frankly, practitioners were easier to talk to than academics because they were seeing it. All right, so that tipped around 2010, and Harvard Business Review started writing a little bit about it, but they still didn't know what to do with it. They were just too traditional. 2014, I said the foundation crumbled. It's like if we had foundations, it was all gone. Things that we assumed and that we expected, rules, norms, standards, they were gone. People didn't realize it, but I saw it in the classroom because I would do this every year in the classroom and I'm out with audiences. The world was already starting this, where you could ask a question that in the past you'd get a straight answer, and now you're getting no answer. There's no agreement from people on anything. In the US in 2016 and 2015, we had an election and we elected a very different kind of leader for us. And so when that happened, then I didn't have any trouble with audiences because I could use Donald Trump as an example. And I was able to use him as an example of a person who rode on a complexity wave to get into office. And there were lots and lots of examples of what happened with that people weren't understanding, but complexity theory explained. Okay. Now, interestingly, if you take Donald Trump full circle, the thing that got him into office of complexity and knowing how to ride it, that's what got him also out of office. So another complexity event happened. The problem with Donald Trump was he knew one way of doing it. When the world shifted on him, he was out of sync. If he had used the things he was doing and pivoted or morphed to that other stage, he would have been okay. But he only had one ride, which was he created chaos. He knew how to create chaos. and put everybody off their balance. And then he would inject things. He understood the dynamic of that. He was not able to cope with that change when it happened. All right, so 2016 in the US, it was much easier. And now in 2020, in 2021, everybody gets it. So I have no problem with it. People are asking, they're begging for it. They want more explanation and understanding. They want to know why they feel the way they do. They want to know what they can do to manage better in this. They want to know how to lead people. And one of the things I do there is I talk with them about how people respond to this and what you need to do. I talked with one who was dealing with entrepreneurs, interestingly. And she was saying they're all off balance. They are waiting for the new normal. This is in the fall. They're waiting for the new normal. What do I do? And I said, you have to, first of all, get them to understand we're already in the new normal. They have to stop waiting. They need to start acting. And she said, well, they're not. And I said, they're not because they're experiencing loss right now. They are entrepreneurs who saw an opportunity. Their businesses are set up. She's thinking they're entrepreneurial. They're able to adapt. And I said, no, they're entrepreneurial in the old world. They set up these businesses and are locked in to an opportunity that was there, but isn't there now. That's why they're trying to hold on and wishing for it to go back. They're actually doing an order response. So you've got to get them off that and get them to understand we are in it right now, which is what I did with my students in the fall. I said, you guys are all waiting. Stop waiting. This is your senior year. It's not going to change. This is what it is. Operate in this right now. It's going to continue to unfold in something else. So bottom line is people want to know about this. They're interested. They don't question the complexity as much now. They want to know, how do we lead differently? And they want specifics on that.
Thank you. Thank you. Certainly parallels my experience as well.
Thank you, Mary. Another question comes from Don Bontempo. Thank you for this presentation. It was fantastic. I wonder how you address this from the level of analysis questions for research. It seems that it can be the practices/dynamics level and the individual level, enabling the adaptive space, and the organizational level, the collective for the organization.
Yes, 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 yes. It's all of it. That's exactly right. It's all of it. And that drives researchers crazy. So researchers want to do reductionism. That's how we're trained. And it's good. It helps us with the scientific process. It helps us to narrow down studies. The problem is the world isn't really reductionist. It is whole and it's complete. So what I think the biggest learning I've had and where I've really tried to help my colleagues and my students is getting them to both and thinking. So we are always doing dichotomies, always doing things, breaking it down one or the other. And I just continue to push on people and. So when I started this work, I got into the big academic debate between the American side and the European side on issues of ontology, epistemology. Oh my gosh, my head was hurting. I was trying to understand what all these people were talking about. Is it constructionist or is it realism? And oh my gosh, were they embedded in their view and locked in so deeply. The world is constructionist and nothing else. The world is individual entity and nothing else. And I kept listening to this going, sorry, this just doesn't work for me because I'm not one or the other, I'm a both. So that was the work I did with Sonia Ospina. And we really dug into what we called relational leadership and really addressed the core philosophical foundations. So to do this work, I've had to address the philosophical foundations, which I wasn't trained in. I have had to address the theoretical foundations. So it's been quite a journey, but the philosophical component is that complexity really is its own ontology. It sees the world as a complex interactive dynamic, and it occurs in relational interactions that has the constructionist element of the relational element, relationality, but that includes individuals with it. So there are individual agents occurring in interactions, and that dynamic scale is scale free. So that would be Bill McKelvey's word, scale free. That's the fractal idea. This dynamic occurs across all levels. So you can study the dynamic and think about how that works, and it includes it. If you want to pick out a level, that's fine. You can do that for your research, but the answer isn't that it's one or the other, it's all of it. So if you're going to dive in, then maybe you're just going to take a zoom in focus and take a snapshot picture of a certain part of it, and that's okay. I would encourage you though to again look at the dynamic.
So this is Dawn. I appreciate that response tremendously. I am finishing up classes at GW and embarking on the dissertation. And that is exactly what I'm struggling with, is the yes and piece of this as a practitioner myself. So I appreciate that answer, and I'm going to go do a bunch more reading.
Great. And Dawn, I would say, you know, you're at GW, they do complexity, right? Are you part of that group there? I've been there before.
So I'm in the human and organizational learning group. So particularly looking at leadership within the HOL. So not necessarily on the complexity side. However, I will say that some of our professors and my advisor in particular is definitely engaged in this. Dr. Julia Storberg-Walker.
Okay, so they have at GW in the business school, they have an executive leadership program that has done complexity. And they would ask me early on, and I would go and talk and give classes there. So you might want to reach out to them because they really were on top of it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
If you can't find them, write me and I'll help you find them.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Don, and thank you, Mary. Now, I'd like to read one of the questions from practitioners, because we've got a few questions from research side. Bauke Andres asks, what are the identifiable, sorry, it's not in the chat, he wrote to me directly. What are the identifiable key characteristics of organizations that allow an adaptive process to operate effectively?
The key identifiable characteristic is that they enable adaptive space. They have adaptive space. And that means that now again, I'm going to say there are different ways to say this. One is they probably bring an adaptive mindset. So an adaptive mindset is the mindset of learning and growth. So a growth mindset focusing on difficulties as a growth opportunity. So if you have a growth mindset, you're experiencing something hard and you say, okay, this is horrible and I hate it, but I know there's some learning I can get from it and I can grow from this. That's a growth mindset. A learning mindset is saying, I'm interested in how I can learn and develop. I'm not going to be in a fixed mindset of the world is this way and I'm going to stay this way. So Carol Dweck's work on that is really beneficial in terms of learning and growth mindset. I package that into a broader adaptive mindset, which brings in some other things too. Then you have the emergence mindset. So if they're really, really good, they have an emergence mindset. And usually that's a more entrepreneurial organization. So entrepreneurial organizations, what entrepreneurs typically are good at is they can see opportunities. That's the emergence. They see that things can connect up. They see that they can engage and drive things in ways that the whole idea is generative emergence, essentially. That's why, again, Benjamin is saying entrepreneurs are all about generative emergence. And I'm saying that's what is the emergence in our theory. Our theory is no longer the scale free or no longer the order for free Kaufman kind of stuff. It's generative emergence, and generative emergence is defined as intentional actions. So Andre started the whole thing with that. We are very specific on the intentional actions that leaders can do. And then the other thing they have is, this is more advanced, but they have what I'm calling the collaboration mindset. This is all the work I've done, I told you about with the theoretical and the philosophical of understanding and really dig into the core of what is leadership. So when we started to do this work, we were realizing that the problem we had is people are thinking in our field, leadership is management. So leaders are managers. So when they would use the word leader, they meant manager. And that was not what I meant by leadership, because I've never viewed leadership as a manager. I viewed it as a behavior, an influence to try to create change. So it's a behavior, or it's an enactment. So when we pulled leadership out of the position and it wasn't a manager, people were like, what is it then? So we had to really dig deep and go to the core. Okay, if it's not the manager, what is leadership? And you'd be shocked. People had no idea how to answer that. So that was where I spent a lot of time, and actually went to Sweden and talked with Mats Alvesson quite a bit, and he really helped spark my thinking on it, that leadership is a co-creation. So it's a co-creation It's and this brings together the construction work, but also the individuals. So individuals come together and they start to enact or engage with one another. Leadership is combined acts of leading and following. So at its core, you have to have leading, which is somebody trying to influence. You have to have following, which is somebody being willing to follow. When those two things come together, now you've got leadership co-created or co-constructed. And this is the followership work that I do. We also lay this out in terms of there are different ways to look at it. It can be a position, it can be an informal role, it can be collective practice. So there are lots of ways to look at leadership. But that all comes together in a collaboration mindset that says, we understand that leadership is not about a manager and a subordinate. We understand that leadership is a collective act when people come together and they engage in actions that can drive change. So organizations that have, or that are best at this have the collaboration mindset, the adaptive mindset, the emergence mindset, and then the outcomes mindset I mentioned earlier, which that's the really hard one. And then they do that to all enable adaptive space. And they're structured to allow that.
Thank you, Mary.
Maybe
Andre?
another question, Brad?
Yes, perhaps one more question from the chat
And then we'll close.
before we start closing. Just last question is from Catherine Peters. Thank you so much, Mary. The process to me seems like it's always there on a certain level. You talked about the adaptive spaces opening up and complexity arising, but aren't those present all the time, even though not necessarily always in our collective awareness? I wonder if it just presents itself to us in the way you described once it all crosses a certain complexity threshold that goes beyond our automatic and unconscious adaptability.
Wow, that's a great question to end it. Okay, so let me think about this for a minute. I'm not sure I got all of it. I didn't read it, I was listening. So the first thing I would say is it's really important to understand that while the world is complex, we don't have to and shouldn't always be in complexity. So as people, if we're in complexity all the time, it is going to kill us. It requires a lot of energy. So I hope and pray that organizations are not constantly in it, because I feel for their people. And this is what we've seen in the last years. We've all been in complexity. We see stress, burnout, mental health issues. I mean, that is an exhausting kind of thing. So yes, there is complexity in the world and there's potential for complexity, but I don't want to say we're always in it. And some leadership occurs not in complexity. It is more in the operational routines. And we need to allow that, and we need to recognize that there's nothing wrong with that. We need to have it. So we want the things that are operating in a routine way, that they're operating efficiently and effectively, like classic organization and management theory. The challenge is that in classic OT and management theory, we didn't have adaptive space, we didn't have complexity. So they talked about it as organic or mechanistic, and they've struggled with this in strategy all along, I think. The idea is, if complexity then starts to enter, and you know this by the pressures coming in, an adaptive challenge or pressure to change, that's when you allow the adaptive space to open up. It addresses and works through it, gets to a new order, a new state of adaptability, and then can operate in the routine again, hopefully. So you want all of that. This again is very much inclusive, both and thinking. It's not one or the other. Oh, and somebody asked earlier about paradox. Paradox is important. I think that the literature is starting to just discover what we're talking about here, that things are paradoxical and that tension is a part of what we do. I don't think they fully get it. I think they're mired in their literature and writing to each other in the way that we do as academics. I'm trying to steer clear of them because they're going to try to impose their paradox thinking on my work. So I'm very careful not to use paradox when I talk about this, but it is completely consistent with it. So hopefully I answered that question, but yes, it's all around us, but we shouldn't be in it all the time.
Thank you, Mary.
Thank you.
Andre?
We do have quite a few more questions in the chat room. So what we'll do is we'll edit them and send them to you so that you can have a look and see what sort of thoughts your talk has provoked. But we also, we always close these webinars in the same way, asking sort of 3 very quick questions in a blitz. And the first question is, who do you think is doing interesting work in this space at the moment? And I know we've met Edmonia and you've mentioned Benjamin, but who else?
Well, I do think there's interesting work in strategy happening. I just don't think they realize they're doing it. I think there's interesting work happening in strategizing as practice. I think there's interesting work happening in the practices literature and communities of practices. So it's all over the place. If you really look out, it's happening everywhere. It's just that people don't have the awareness. And the challenge we've had historically is people don't get complexity and it's too complicated for them to learn. So they reject it. But if we could get more people understanding, if we really could teach people complexity and get people in the mindset of complexity, so many things would open up to us, which is why I think the work you all are doing is interesting in terms of trying to advance the understanding of complexity.
Fantastic. We hope so as well. So the second question is a bit more reflective, I suppose. What would you say is your formative reading in this space? What was the formative reading for you?
So the first book I read was Russ Marion's Edge of Organization. That was his 1999 book. That's what started the whole thing for me. And then he trained me in complexity. And then I struggled to find other complexity books that worked. So I would then say, Benjamin will love me for this. This is the formative reading, the Generative Emergence book, because I kept looking for complexity books that would work and none of them did. And then I actually literally just sat on my pool last summer and read this and marked it all up and made all of my notes and comments and then called Benjamin and said, I'm so excited by this because I wasn't ready for it before. I needed to have the right time to read it. I needed to solidify my own understanding. And once that locked in and it crystallized, then I was able to look at this and say, okay, now we've got it. So.
Okay. And then the final question is, what are you reading at the moment? What's on your desk?
So I've been mostly in the last year gathering examples from COVID and from the social justice movement. So I'm not reading as much theory stuff, although my next dive in is to go look and see what the literature says on the adaptive process and adaptability. I cannot wait. I mean, that's going to be so exciting. So, you know, in 2018, I went and looked at the literature to see adaptability itself. And that took me to strategy, OT kinds of things and qualitative work. Now I want to, with the understanding of the adaptive process, really dig in and find out more the human side of it and see what psychology has to say about this. And that's the paper I want to write, is looking at tension. So I think it's going to be more conflict literature. I want to get into innovation literature a bit more. I know the network stuff pretty well, so I don't need that, but it'll be more conflict, more stress, more looking for things around connecting and how we do that. And then the psychology literature around this.
Fantastic. Thank you. And thank you again for making the time to talk to us. And thank you for a fascinating talk.
I appreciate it. And if you could save the chat for me, I didn't get a chance to read it. So I'd love if you could download it and send it to me.
We'll absolutely do that. Yes.
Thank you, Mary.
Thank you,
Thank you everyone for joining.
for attending.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of the day.
You too. Thanks.
We'll be in touch.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.